Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the Black Death, right? We started talking today in class, of course, about none other than the Black Death plague epidemic that is going to sweep through Europe from 1347 to about 1351, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is we left off in class talking about why Europe was prime for the plague itself, and we also talked a little bit about as well, like, is it a bacterial infection? Is it a viral infection? Have we seen this plague before? And the answer was a big fat emphatic yes. We actually saw it before when we talked about the plague of Justinian, right? Well, we didn't talk about it until now, and we talked about how, like, Justinian actually got the plague and then, like, didn't die, and how, like, Theodora is going to rule for him whilst he is sick. But the big thing, though, is we left off in class mostly talking about why Europe was the perfect target for the plague, okay? And we talked about this process called urbanization, right? This massive influx of people from the countryside into the cities that's going to start right around the beginning of the 1300s, okay? Really kind of going alongside with the advancements in agricultural technology. We talked about how plows and mills are going to be a really big thing that replace the need for tons and tons of workers on some of these feudal farms, and so they're going to begin to move into cities. And the walled cities that actually existed mostly during the Middle Ages are going to turn into disgusting cesspits of overcrowded because they don't have any indoor plumbing. They don't have any actual access to remove dead bodies. Like, literally, they talked about how if they knew you died, they were like, oh, did someone die on Tuesday? They would smell you rotting from your house, okay? It's not like you texted anybody be like, hey, y'all, I died, come get me. So the thing about it that we need to understand, though, as well, is Europe was a prime target due to that overcrowding, okay? And another big reason why Europe is a prime target is because there was a massive set of climatological shifts that actually happened during the 1300s and lasted for upwards of about, like, about 600 years going forward in European history, okay? So something that we need to understand is we're now talking also about how climate change and famine is going to also make Europe just a huge target for the Black Plague itself. Because by 1300s, or by the 1300s, population was very high, okay? It had never been actually this high in Europe since the fall of Rome, and what's happening basically is you've got large output of agricultural products. You've got most people being decently fed. You have the increase in economics and things like that, and more employment happening. But what's going to happen, though, right around the beginning of the 1300s is a moment in history that many historians actually refer to as the Little Ice Age, right? Now, the Little Ice Age is not going to be like the Pleistocene epoch in history, okay? So, for example, when I say Ice Age, some of y'all think like, you know, huge stuff with like the movie and the squirrel and Sid the Sloth being like, I don't know if it's going to be so good. So the thing that you need to understand, though, is that the Little Ice Age is going to be a small, about 600-year time period where they're going to be about a half of a degree Celsius drop on average throughout most of the European continent, throughout most of the world. Now, the climate change in Europe, though, is going to produce several years of crop failures, mostly due to the fact that this slight climatological shift that actually started in 1300 and ranged all the way up until about almost the year 1900, give or take, if you want to make the big arguments, but it was at its worst right around like 1400 to 1600. So like now the thing about it, though, is from 1315 to 1317, when this entire Little Ice Age begins, you're going to see massive amounts of rain, which is going to lead to a bunch of crop failures of wheat and barley, the two foodstuffs that actually make bread, which is still the biggest thing that people eat during this time period. This is then going to lead to a famine, and the famine is known as the Great Famine from 1315 to 1317. And as many as 15% of some peasants on record in English villages died of starvation during this thing. Now, the big thing to understand, though, is that in conjunction now with this change in temperature, and then also with this famine that's now wreaking havoc from 1315 to 1317, about 30 years later, by 1347, when the plague actually makes landfall in Europe, you're going to see one giant consequence play out. The consequence of the climatological shift and then also the famine is that starvation and poverty are going to make people more susceptible to disease, right? Because you're being underfed, you're not actually having as many wheat harvests anymore, and the bread supply is actually a little bit lower than it used to be. And if you're not well fed, it actually really decreases your ability to fight off a disease. And so when the disease actually shows up due to this Little Ice Age and stuff like that, you're going to see some really bad stuff happen, right? Because it came right after the medieval warm period, which this actually led to the Vikings colonizing Greenland, and then also it led to a population increase, right? So think about it, y'all. We got overcrowded cities, way too many people, a famine, and now a Little Ice Age on our hands. So Europe is just perfect for the plague to actually want to sit there and like come after, right? So the thing that we need to understand though too is, where did the plague come from? It's not like all of a sudden one day it just went and just popped up out of nowhere. But you have to understand where this plague originated. Now, the first evidence we have of the plague itself, actually remember, if you actually can kind of dig deep in your mind, there was that Eastern Golden Age, right? That monsoon marketplace. The era when the Asians, the Arabs, and the African kingdoms were being very, very prosperous and making tons of money, okay? Now, in conjunction with this, they're also going to record heavy amounts of their history. And the first evidence we have of the plague itself pops up in China, right? Now, it pops up in China, and that's just the first recorded evidence we have. We have no idea where the plague actually came from originally. We think that it actually might have come, like, some scientists and some historians have gotten together and they think that it might have actually popped up in the steppe region towards Mongolia in a thing known as a plague reservoir, right? So a plague reservoir is basically an area that has tons of rodents and stuff like that, but not a lot of humans around. So we think that there's actually one large plague reservoir over near the Caspian Sea, which actually borders the southern areas of Russia and also the western territories of Mongolia and northwest China, right? And then in that area, we think that that plague reservoir actually had some of the bacteria pop up inside of it and lived inside of several different rodents, okay? Now, the big particular rodents that carried this like plague bacteria around with them are rats, right? Now, the thing that you need to understand, though, is that in China, when we actually have on record, I think it's 1331, when they actually start dealing with their plague epidemic, the population of China, not Beijing, this is actually, wrong, you can, ignore Beijing. The population of China, when they actually did a census in the early 1300s, or, in 1200, actually, was 120 million people. And then when they redo the census in the 1300s, there's only 65 million people, okay? So you're talking about half of their population was wiped out by plague, just like it's going to happen to the Europeans. The plague hit Persia, it hit India, it hit everywhere. Unless you were on a small island isolated away, the plague is going to come from you. And why was that? Why did it spread so quickly all the way from China all the way to Europe? A lot of it, y'all, has to do with trade, right? A lot of it has to do with trade and the Silk Road. If we look at the spread of the plague from the eastern territories during the Eastern Golden Age, it looks and appears almost on a linear path, right? Following the Silk Road itself. Because think about it. Traders carry large amounts of products, right? These products tend to attract rats, right? And these rats have the all-encompassing flea that rides along on them that are the big spreaders of the plague more than anything else, right? You didn't really get the plague from a rat itself. You usually got it from the flea that bit you that was riding around on a rat in the first place. The other big thing about it, though, as well, is we're going to see basically the reason why it hits Europe eventually, a lot of it has to do with the Mongolians, okay? So the Mongolians during this time period controlled most of what you consider of modern-day Russia, heavy amounts of heavy amounts of Eastern Europe, and then also areas in Northwest Asia as well. And these are going to be right next to the European continent. The Mongols were devastated by the plague, just like China, just like Persia, just like India, and the places that came before them, because the Mongols actually heavily used the Silk Road. But a big thing that does end up happening is we actually see and hear about where we believe patient zero originated for the European version of the plague, okay? Patient zero is that first person that has it. That's a European that's going to carry it over to Europe, and it's going to begin to spread, right? And we believe it happened when the Mongols actually attacked a city called Kaffa, right? Kaffa was actually on the Caspian Sea. It's in the area of Crimea in the modern day. And apparently, what they were very, very well known for doing is the Mongolians apparently hucked dead plague bodies inside the city of Kaffa on purpose to try and actually spread the disease at will. And they hucked these dead bodies into the city that they were attacking at the city of Kaffa. Literally, the bodies would go and splatter everywhere and stuff like that, and the plague bacteria got pushed up into the air, right? And we believe that people running away from that city actually jumped on some boats and were heading towards Europe, and they went to the island of Sicily. And because of that attack, we believe that in 1347, the very first vessel actually docks at Messina in Sicily, and we believe that the plague ship hit Sicily right there in 1347. Rats began to crawl down the ropes and stuff like that had also been infected with the plague, and then from that point, we start seeing it spread like wildfire throughout the rest of Europe, because those rats had those fleas, and let's talk about that real fast, right? So how did the plague spread so quickly? Because by 1350, the plague is everywhere, okay? The Black Death plague is now everywhere, from literally Italy all the way up to Norway, and then all the way out towards Russia. So something that you need to understand is there's two different ways you can contract the plague, right? You have the bubonic form of the plague, and then you have the pneumonic form of the plague. Well, the bubonic form of the plague you get from these little guys, right? Those little dudes are known as fleas, right? Fleas are the biggest carriers of the bacteria, right? Mostly due to the fact that plague bacteria loves to live inside of blood, all right? Like it particularly loves to live inside of blood and underneath the surface of the skin. So they would actually go up to rats that had the bacterium inside of them, and then the fleas bite on the rat and they get infected. What happens immediately in that point is then literally the fleas get a blockage in their throat of the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, growing at a rate to the point that when they bite their next victim, they do like this. They go and they literally vomit the plague bacteria into the next person, right? So that is absolutely disgusting. And like literally flea bites were the thing that they would go and then like vomit it straight into your body. You could also get it from scratches and bites from rats, but it was actually pretty rare. And then also handling dead animals that had the plague. Because something y'all need to understand too, y'all, is farm animals died from the plague. Huge numbers of cows and pigs and like literally meat animals are gonna die from the plague too. And it literally did not care if you were a man, animal, child, woman, older, younger, whatever, this bacteria is coming for you. That's why in the 1300s, a bacterial infection is so much worse than a viral one, right? So the plague literally is going to spread in that bubonic form, mostly from these fleas, okay? Now the pneumonic form is what we believe is the late stage of the plague, right? Maybe after a couple of people in your town actually get the plague, they might have the pneumonic form of the plague, where literally the interior area of their lungs is beginning to bleed, and they're coughing out droplets and fluids that actually have little tiny microbes of the bacteria inside of it. Little bits of infected blood that they're spewing out into the air because they're not covering their mouth and stuff like that, giving you the pneumonic form. And I don't think you understand just how gross it is when you sneeze and stuff like that, but y'all, it's nasty. Like, it's so gross. If you actually look at this guy sneezing in slow motion, it's absolutely insane how much stuff comes out of your face when you sneeze, and it's coming out at the speed of 60 miles an hour. And look at all this stuff. It's so gross. Look at that mustache blow in the wind. That's why you need to cover your mouth. And that's how you spread the pneumonic form of the plague as well. Pretty nasty, right? I know. Tell me about it. So gross. All right, now, going into it, though, too. Come on. There we go. We got to, make sure these kids don't throw up. So, going into it, though, also, you need to understand what are the symptoms when you got the plague. So, when you actually got the plague, you usually knew that somebody had it due to, the common symptoms, the basic symptoms being, fever, headache, chills, nausea, stuff like that. That's how you probably knew that you had it. But there's big sign indicators that you definitely had it. One of them is this thing called a bulbus, right? A bulbus is a swelling of your lymph nodes, okay? And you usually got a bulbus or an infected lymph node that actually gather pus and other fluids and stuff like that inside and around that lymph node, because what lymph nodes do as a part of your lymphatic system is they are there to try and fight off disease. They kind of try to corner it all together so your body can find it and attack it. Issue is, y'all, is that this is a bacteria. It loves buddying up with itself, and it's going to keep eating and doubling in size, right? So the thing about it is the bulbus would grow, and you would sometimes get them on your neck, under your arms, or right on the inside of your thighs, right? Now, the object of here, though, in the Middle Ages, is a lot of doctors would come along, and they would do called lancing that bulbus. They would take, a scalpel or a knife and cut it open and squeeze all the gunk out. That gunk, though, y'all, that's bacteria, right? That's literally Yersinia pestis coming out of those bulbus, and so now these doctors are actually getting infected as well. So the other big one that you could see as well is literally known as necrosis or necrotic flesh. And if I can actually go back and find that one real quick, is it actually there? Where did I put that little guy? So you can see some necrotic plague flesh. All right, look, I'll tell you what we'll do. Real fast, we'll just do one of these little googlies. All right, so now, so if we literally actually look at, plague. Plague. Oh, wait, that says oh my God, plague necrosis. So necrosis is also another symptom that you would get when literally your body, your skin would begin to turn black, right? And it actually begins to that's the septicemic form of the plague. And almost always, if you see somebody with necrosis of the flesh due to the plague, it means that they are almost assuredly going to die, and especially during the Middle Ages. But basically what is happening is your flesh is beginning to rot while it's still attached to your body. Now, the bulbus and the plague necrosis are basically the necrosis of the flesh are the two biggest signs that you've got this plague, and it's going to be pretty rough for you, right? Now, also during this time period, it's going to cause massive amounts of hysteria, and they are going to try their best to fight it off, right? And so there were a lot of popular medical cures for the plague, right? The one that you know of very, very well is, of course, the plague doctor outfit, which, interestingly enough, we only have a couple of sources of. Everybody thinks that the plague doctor outfit was a widespread thing, right? That all these doctors were running around dressed like birds and stuff like that, and just literally had different kinds of floral notes and lavender and flowers shoved into the end of that beak and stuff like that. We only know of a couple of times that ever even actually happened, but still, regardless, if it happened once, it's still pretty kind of interesting and things like that these doctors are wearing this super strange costume. Also, bathing in human urine apparently became a very popular cure because they thought that it was clean and stuff like that, going all the way back to the ancient Romans who used to bathe their clothes in it, and so they would literally actually apparently wipe themselves off with their own urine, hoping to get rid of the plague, but it didn't do anything because the plague bacteria is underneath your skin, right? Another big one was like sleeping with onions on your body or washing yourself in vinegar. Now, one of the other more popular ones is actually going to hang on for quite a while is a system known as bloodletting, right? Bloodletting is where a doctor would come in using this device and go up to one of your veins and cut it open and literally just eke some of your blood out of your body and drain you of your blood, thinking that maybe you had too much infected blood in your body. But now we've got a tin of plague-infested blood literally inside of a cup, so we're just bringing it closer to ourselves, right? Now, another big thing about it, though, as well, I got bathing in urine on here twice because it's that gross. Also, leeching became really big. Rubbing chickens on your body. They would literally, like, pluck the bottom of a chicken and, like, tie it to themselves, or rubbing a chicken on their body. And the other one was unicorn horn. Apparently, merchants got very popular for selling the stuff known as the horn of a unicorn powder, like a powdered thing that the merchants swear up and down that it came from a unicorn, and that by inhaling it or ingesting it, it would help you fight off the plague. What we found out is that it actually wasn't unicorn horn. We think it actually might have been narwhal horn, which is a type of whale, right, that has a horn on the top of its face. Now, for any of you who don't know what a narwhal is, this is what a narwhal is.
Bye, buddy. Hope you find your dad.
Thanks, Mr. Narwhal. Bye.
Exactly, right? Bye, Mr. Narwhal. No, thanks, Mr. Narwhal. But the big thing about it, though, is they would actually apparently, like, kill those whales and grind their horns down and sell it, telling everybody it's unicorn horn. Now, obviously, those things did not work, right? Those things didn't work at all. Now, there's a lot of things that we need to understand, though, that yes, of course, looking at these crazy medical cures, none of these things actually worked. But then what things did actually work to help stop the plague? Because it didn't kill everybody in all of Europe, right? So what are some ways that it actually did come to an end? Well, one of them is just simple. Better hygiene, right? If you might want to actually underneath this put like actual cures for the plague, right? Actual cures for the plague, of course, encompass actual hygiene, right? Of course, another one is like spreading out, moving out into the countryside and things like that was another big one. And another last one that became very, very adamantly popular is a thing known as quarantine, right? Quarantining people became a very, very commonly used strategy to try and avoid the plague from spreading too fast. Where the word quarantine actually comes from is the Italian word for quarenta, right? Which quarenta means 40, but it's okay. Like, literally, it's the number of days that you were supposed to be quarantined away from everyone to see if you had the plague. And it was a practice actually used in Italy, of like, literally, like, after the plague actually struck there first, where any boat that actually sailed up, all the sailors had to stay on it for 40 straight days to make sure that nobody had the plague, because the plague could kill you in about a week, right? So, like, now, but the big thing about it, though, is that simple quarantining thing actually came about. Now, another one is a very, very crazy, funny little thing where one of the popes, like, sat between two giant bonfires, and they actually realized that having a fire lit in your house was really good because it would kill some of the airborne bacteria and stuff like that. But the big three are, of course, spreading out, better hygiene, and quarantining were really actual legitimate medical cures to this entire thing. Now, another thing that we need to understand, though, is what are the effects of the plague, right? Well, the funny thing about it is if you were to really cook down the effects of the plague, they can be broken down into about 5 simple little things, right? One, an upsurge in faith and religion, because literally Christianity got stronger and more intense. Artistic representation is going to be a big effect. The economy, population decrease, and anti-Semitism, right? So let's start off with the upsurge in Christianity, right? Surprisingly enough, Christianity and the church are going to grow more powerful because of the plague, because a lot of people believed that literally it was because the devil was coming to earth and that God was mad at them, right? So they actually became more penitent, they began to pray more, and you could see little kind of groups of people begin to pop up that were super, super religious. One of the most famous ones are these people called flagellants. Mr. Mathern loves to talk about flagellants, right? So anytime you have an excuse to bring up flagellants to Mr. Mathern, he'll talk about them all day. And they're basically these people that used to wander around medieval cities, and they would pray and then beat themselves with whips and stuff like that. And they'd be like, God won't be mad at me if I beat myself and I'll avoid the plague. And so they would literally pray and be like, bam! And would just hit themselves in the back and stuff like that. Now, another big thing about it is artistic representation. Art during the time period became obsessed with death and realism, right? This, for example, one of the very famous ones known as the Danse Macabre is a very, very famous print that actually came out right after the Black Death, right? And as you can see, it actually has dancing skeletons ushering people into an early grave. The very, very first picture on this presentation actually has a very famous piece of plague art on it as well, and so it's a lot of death and a lot of representations of death. This is how art is going to change. Now, the economy is a big one as well. Now, during the plague itself, there was high unemployment and economic stagnation, which means things dipped a little bit. But after, there's less people around. There's going to be more specialty crops, more specialized jobs, and more money in the hands of individuals. And we'll explain that a little bit in class and stuff like that, and kind of talk about how the plague is actually going to free up a lot of these different kind of economic things, and also it's going to kind of like weaken the feudal system a little bit as well. There's also going to be a population increase. Well, duh, it's a giant plague, right? Like, it's going to kill anywhere from what we understand from 75 million to 200 million people worldwide, which was about 40% of the world population, right? And then, of course, another really big one that's going to have a massive outbreak as well is an outbreak of anti-Semitism, because literally a lot of European populations were actually going to blame this on Jewish communities. Now, Jewish communities didn't get hit by the plague as hard, but that wasn't their fault. The reason why Jewish communities didn't get hit by the plague as hard is because most European countries and kingdoms segregated them away from everyone else. Well, of course they're not going to get hit by it very hard if you tell them they have to live over there, away from all the people with plague. Ho ho! Good process of elimination, dummies. Now, so the thing about it, though, as well, you're going to see several different instances, like the Strasbourg massacre and other very major massacres, where apparently upwards of several thousand Jewish people were actually killed because they were blamed for bringing the plague, even though they had nothing to do with it whatsoever. And that's what anti-Semitism is. It's the industrialized dislike or hatred towards people of the Jewish faith, okay? So the thing that we need to understand, though, is that these big 5 things are going to be your massive effects of the plague. And like we said as well, one of the earlier things as well, make sure that you didn't miss how the plague actually finally ended, of course, when we're talking about quarantine, better hygiene, and spreading out, okay? But that is going to be the stuff that we talk about with the plague, and then tomorrow, we're going to start up the Renaissance. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.